From the Flint Hills Writing Project, this is The Suggestion Box, where teachers get ideas. I'm Andrea Marshbank. Today we're talking to Dr. Michelle Devereaux and Darren Krovitz of Kennesaw State University in Georgia. They both teach pre-service English teachers at Kennesaw and are here today to talk to us specifically about the issue, and I use the word issue very purposefully, of grammar instruction. I will give you some feedback for how I found Michelle and Darren and hunted them down to be on this podcast because I did actively seek them out. I first met Michelle and Darren when they were presenting at the NCTE convention in 2017 in St. Louis. They were doing a session on grammar and the room was packed. Like, there were teachers sitting on the floor. It was just so crowded. And I think that maybe more than anything else really speaks to how we're referring to grammar as an issue. We are, as a community of educators, very confused on how to teach grammar and how to teach it well, and sometimes even on how to teach it to ourselves first and foremost. We want a new conversation about grammar as a whole. We want to feel like there is hope for us outside of isolated worksheets that are passed out without a lot of context, and they gave us as educators exactly that. During their presentation, they spoke a lot about great ideas regarding the teaching of grammar that really stuck with me, that we're going to address, pretty in depth in this podcast today. And as a result of watching their session, I bought their book, which is called Grammar to Get Things Done. It's published by Routledge and NCTE, which I don't think I explained earlier, folks who are not English teachers. That is the National Council of Teachers of English. And I loved their book so much. I bought it and I read it in probably like 3 days, which is pretty intense for a book on grammar. And the first 3 chapters, just so you know, are set up as kind of this discussion of philosophy and of acknowledging our past relationships with grammar and moving forward. And then the 4th chapter is all about the nitty-gritty of like defining terms and suggestions for how to incorporate this into the classroom setting that you already have. And I loved the book. Oh, I loved the book. I loved it so much that I actually bullied my English department into reading it with me over the summer. I'll get back to you on that, on whether or not they love it too. In this interview, we spend a great deal of time referring to the concepts in the books. Whenever we reference a book, we are talking about Grammar to Get Things Done by Michelle and Darren. At some point in time, they do talk about a new book, which we will be addressing later on in the podcast. They are coming out with a brand new book, which is awesome. So in the content of this podcast, we're talking about grammar instructions, our relationships with grammar as people, why grammar even matters overall, and some techniques on how to be better at teaching grammar. And folks, this is not just for English teachers. And I can't stress that enough. For such a long time, we've kind of allocated, okay, kids can't write, kids struggle with grammar, that's the English teacher's problem. But if you are not an English teacher, I urge you to keep listening because we do throw in a mix of discussion of science and a little bit of social studies, and we are huge fans on the Suggestion Box, absolutely huge fans of learning from everyone. There is so much to take away from every discussion. So stay tuned. It's fantastic. It's a great interview. Michelle and Darren are probably the nicest people that I ever tracked down on Twitter just so that I could interview them. And yeah, enjoy the interview. Good morning, Michelle and Darren. It's so nice to have you on the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to talk about grammar today. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. I just am curious to start off with the beginning of your grammar journey. How did the both of you learn grammar? Like, what happened that inspired you to, do so much work on grammar? Do you feel like your own grammar education was lacking? Do you feel like it was actually exceptionally good and that is what spurred you forward?
My grammar experience in grade school and secondary school was pretty horrendous. I got the sheets, the worksheets, and I was told to, circle the predicate and underline the subject, and I did all of it dutifully because I was a good student, and my grammar was still terrible. I got into college. I took a grammar class that still had me do worksheets, except they were the worksheets at the end of each chapter, right? And it wasn't until I started my PhD and I started focusing on linguistics in the classroom that I started realizing the injustice we're doing to students in the ways that we're teaching them grammar now, and what research says is effective and has shown to be effective. And so I really was self-taught, in all honesty. It was me spending hours and hours and hours and hours with grammar books because it's fascinating. Like, language is just amazing. And so a lot of what I do and my beliefs are based on my own explorations.
And my history in school is about the same as Michelle's. I had fairly traditional grammar instruction in elementary school and middle school. I don't really remember a whole lot in high school. But I like to read and I like to write. I was a good student, and so I was able to negotiate any kind of requirement in a class to do grammar on a test or something like that, no problem. And in terms of my own grammar usage, because I was reading so much and I didn't hate writing, you pick up on the moves that you make and how language works just by exposure to all different kinds of text. So I kind of rode that for a long time. And then when I got into preparing other English teachers and being an English teacher myself, there's a weird thing that happens because you can avoid grammar entirely. You can just avoid that kind of granular language instruction and hope nobody asks you about it and that you don't actually have to teach it. And if it comes up, you kind of just like, yeah, we'll get to that later. I think that's what happens with a lot of us, because it turns out, just like with Michelle, I didn't know a lot of the names for things, names for certain concepts or key grammar terms. I could use them, but I didn't know what they were called, and I didn't feel confident.
For sure. I feel like your experiences, a lot of aspects of both of your experiences, Michelle and Darren, really pertain to my own. And so that makes me think that a lot of us are maybe in your boat. I also was a huge reader, Darren, growing up. And so I did for a very long time just make do with, you recognize when you read so many books, you start to see that. And I think that I've heard teachers in my own building say, my kids who read know grammar. They don't know that they know grammar, but somehow they do. They don't have the words for it. I think that that's really great that you guys, well, in some ways, I think it's great that we are recognizing the kind of universal, like we as a society need to do a little better.
Yeah, avoidance is characteristic. And it's not just in middle school or high school. It's all the way through college as well. Like I'm sure a lot of our colleagues don't feel particularly on strong terrain with their own explicit grammar knowledge.
And I think that you bring up another point about learning grammar in college is that I don't know that we, as teachers, maybe especially teachers who are specifically going into English, but arguably all teachers, because we should all be teaching writing and communication skills, get a lot of grammar instruction. I feel like it kind of they're very lucky to have you, because I imagine, do you touch on grammar in your education courses for your pre-teachers?
Yes. So but that is after, we had gotten the feedback from our local schools saying, hey, your pre-service teachers need some help with grammar. We had to look at our program and go, okay, where are we lacking? How can we improve what we're doing? And not just improve our courses, but also improve our own understanding and knowledge. I mean, I think Darren and I can both say that we upped our game when it was like, all right, so how can we know grammar now, but how can we teach it effectively, not only to our pre-service teachers, but teaching them how to teach it to their students, right? Because those types of instruction look different. And I think that's something important that we need to talk about, that how I teach my pre-service teachers need to know the terminology, but then how much terminology do their students need to know? And I would argue that it's not as much nor as specialized as what the pre-service teachers need to know.
Yeah, I agree. Like the terminology can seem pretty strange, especially to a high school student or a middle school student.
What's in a positive, right?
Yeah,
what
positive,
does that matter?
Dependent clause, subordinating conjunction. It all sounds like complex terms that no one will ever use in their real life. And they've got a point, right? It's like, do they really need to know like the official name or the official definition of something? Does that actually help them? Can't you use another term that might be just as good?
Now, I do want to clarify that we're not arguing that you shouldn't be teaching subordinate clauses, dependent clauses, appositives, participles, conjunctive adverbs, what have you. I think what we're arguing here is that we have to be cognizant of how we teach those to our students in ways that are based in what do those grammar moves actually do.
I do want to ask you the trickier question of what do you do when you meet feedback from students, or have you ever met feedback from colleagues or maybe people in your community who say, just overall, a little bit of what Darren said, why are we teaching this at all? Because there are teachers in my building who are excellent teachers who definitely feel, grammar is a little bit, I don't want to say outdated, but is something that comes naturally per se. They feel like we don't need to directly instruct it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to take this one. So first of all, I absolutely agree with your teacher's argument and the fact that language is innate, right? We are all magnificent users of language because we've been doing it forever, and we pick up on the cadence of language while we're still in our mother's womb. So, I mean, your students are walking into the classroom as language experts, as brilliant language users, and I think that's one point I want to explicitly discuss because I think we need to change the lens of how we see our students when they walk into the classroom, right? That you are coming in as a brilliant language user rather than you're coming in not knowing what a positive is and you don't know what a subordinate clause is and you don't know what this is, but coming in saying your innate knowledge of language is powerful and it's magnificent and it's unique to you and your experience, and we need to bring that into the classroom and use that as a strength. I think the second point there is, I forgot. The second point is that why do students need to know this stuff? And I think the answer for that is power, right? It comes down to questions of power. And having access to powerful language moves gives you power in mainstream America. And so I think we need to have these explicit conversations with our students about power and what that looks like and how language is tied to power and about how you make choices every day to gain or sustain power through language. And each context, different language used to gain and sustain that power. And so standard American English can help you gain and sustain power in certain areas. And there are many dialects, many ways of using language. I mean, where I'm from in rural Georgia, standard American English is not the thing that gets me power. There's nothing wrong with that, but we need to be having those conversations with our students. And so why do we explicitly need to teach students to be cognizant of language is so that they can gain, sustain, and consider power in different contexts in purposeful ways.
I have nothing to add to that. That was comprehensive.
I'm sorry.
No, that was amazing. I think that's really, it speaks to maybe a lot of the discussions that we should be having with our students. And so that conversation could be extraordinarily helpful. What else do both of you do in your own classrooms at the collegiate level, or have you observed other teachers doing that are tangible examples of how they promote that these grammar, that learning grammar is an act of power versus an act of you've been wrong all your life and I'm teaching you the right way?
Yeah, I think so. The first way to approach it, the way I like to approach it is not here's a term, here's a definition, here's a worksheet, because that automatically frames the learning situation as, wow, look at all the things I don't know. I feel uncomfortable. I feel anxiety. I feel the residue of bad memories from previous grammar experiences where I felt stupid as well. I like to start with something that sort of clears the table of all that stuff. And the way to do that, I think, is to invoke real situations. And we try to get at that with the book. That's a set of approaches that try to reach that point where it says, let's look at some episodes or situations or scenarios out of real life that might sound similar to experiences you've been in the past. How might we use language to negotiate the situation in a way that allows us to get what we want or allows us to communicate something without hurting somebody else's feelings? We were just talking about this earlier today, and the importance of language and negotiating not just power, like power structures in corporate America or in academia or whatever, but just the dilemmas and crises of your life in relationships with other people. If you can't use language carefully to preserve somebody else's feelings, to communicate how you're feeling about something, but also that takes into consideration their emotional well-being. I mean, it's crucial that you have those skills to use language in that way. If you don't, you're going to have a series of turbulent relationship moments, right? Where the person is hearing something else that sounds aggressive or it sounds hurtful because you haven't phrased it in a way that acknowledges how they're feeling. And so it can get down to that basic level that the way we convey meaning as social creatures is through language. I think that's a much more effective way than to say that here's an isolated grammar term that you never learned and you feel stupid now, and I'm going to make you feel even more stupid because you don't remember and you won't remember after this lesson. Instead, let's talk about real situations and how language helps us work through that.
Absolutely. That's really inspiring. I think that so often we sometimes get caught up in education and like we're teaching you these new things, but we're not empowering the student and letting them feel like they are capable, right? That growth mindset of like, I can do this, or I have been, I just need better, or I need more accurate terminology for it. So that's awesome. Let's not make our students feel stupid. Yeah.
And I also want to add an addendum to that I am not a language expert in this area. Okay, I have a lot of growth to do in how I use words and sentences with those I'm in relationships with to be better in the world, right? To nurture those relationships, to make those I care about feel cared about with words, to express myself. So don't get the idea that I've got some lock on this. It's certainly something that I struggle with, and that I'm trying to pay more attention to, not just in academic or professional situations, but in all the personal and social situations that I find myself in.
I feel like this is part of the podcast where we're like, all right, Darren's friends and family. He knows he has things to work on.
Yeah, if anybody listens, they're like, yeah, you're no expert, dude.
I would like to go back to the original question, if you don't mind, to talk about how I kind of introduced this idea to students. And that's a discussion of dichotomy in language, right? That so often we see language as either good or bad or right or wrong, correct or incorrect. And that's how it gets labeled so often. And one thing that I do that I actually got, this idea came from a teacher friend of mine many years ago, but you ask students to label how they hear academic English, standard English, described. And so they use these words as good, right, proper, educated. And so then if you put a column next to it and you say, okay, if standard English is all of these things, what is anything but standard English? And so it's wrong, improper, uneducated, bad. And so that kind of stark comparison really hits students, because then we start having a discussion about how you can't separate language from the user, which I think is what we've both been talking about here the entire time, the importance of context, because you're a part of that context, like you as a human being is part of that context. And so if we're labeling language as good, right, and then bad, wrong, are we not also implicitly labeling the people who use those language varieties? And is that really what you want to teach your students, that everyone who uses standard American English, and I use quotes here, air quotes, to say standard American English, because a lot of linguists argue that standard American English is not spoken, that it's only written. So those who speak, quote, quote, standard American English are good and right and proper people, and those who don't are all of these negative associations. And I don't know any teacher, I've never come across a teacher who says, that's what I want to teach my students. And so I think we need to bring those kinds of conversations and problematize how we dichotomize language nowadays, and not nowadays, forever, and how to make it the messy thing that it is. Language is messy. Yeah. We need to get in the mess.
It's a territory too of conflict and tension and judgment, sometimes scorn. Just pay attention to how people are quick to criticize other people for how they write or how they speak.
I actually keep a run-in list in my phone on a notes page of all the things people say to me about my accent, because I travel a lot. And so I keep a running list. One of these days I'm going to write an article to go back and say how all these people are wrong.
Oh my goodness, I am blown away. People say things about your accent like...
Oh my God, would you like to hear some?
I do, yes. Do you have the list? Oh my goodness.
In my phone, I keep a list, so when people say stuff to me, I'm like, that's going to my list. It's going to my article one of these days.
Oh, that's a good way to look at that. That is the most optimistic view. I can't imagine people, that's in every part of my being. Why would you do that?
Oh, it's great. Let's see. You can't be from the South. You have all of your teeth. You sure do sound country, but you look city. You're gentle country. I can understand what you say. And then my favorite one, and I get this one fairly regularly, is like I said, I like talking to strangers. I like having conversations with folks who, may not sound the way I sound. And I get this comment about twice a year that, boy, I sure am glad we talked, Michelle, because I really thought you were stupid the first time you opened your mouth.
No.
And that one comes regularly.
Michelle.
Yeah, I know, but it's great because then I can have a conversation with them and say, okay, let's talk about these ideologies that you're putting on me and the problems with it. And it makes for great conversation because people are like, well, holy goodness, there's all this stuff going on that I hadn't considered in the way that I'm viewing people. And we all do this. I mean, I write books about it and I still catch myself sometimes going, oh, come on, Michelle, you're better than this.
Oh yeah, that's self-regulation.
Exactly. But we all live with these ideologies and we have to, like our grammar instruction and our grammar knowledge, we have to bring those ideologies to the surface so we can contend with them, right?
People want to talk about this stuff, it's sort of buried, but it's there. And it percolates through all of these interactions. I'm a Northerner, generally speaking. I moved around a lot as a kid, but I consider myself sort of like regionally, where am I from? I would say I'm a Northerner. I'm not a Southerner, that's for sure. And so I've had to learn, I've lived in the South, in Georgia, at least for 13 years, and I've had to learn about how I handle linguistic difference in the South. Because, and Michelle has had to correct me a number of times, not so much anymore, one would hope.
No, not nearly as much.
But something I would see as sort of a good-natured joshing, like, hey, you pronounce fire far, listen to that far, that's kind of funny. There's an element of power and an element of stereotype to that. And so I had to check myself a number of times until I realized I have all these biases that are latent about certain kinds of accents.
Well, and Lippy Green in her book argues that, language discrimination is the only acceptable discrimination left in America. And so that's something that we need to have conversations with about our students. And all of this is tied into grammar. I don't know if anyone's listening thinking, oh, they're going away from grammar discussion. We are in the midst of true grammar discussion here. In so much that, because every dialect, every variation follows a grammar. And if anyone wants to know, a resource for that, please email me. I will be more than happy to share resources with that. But grammar is nothing more than the pattern of language. We often get the words usage and grammar mixed up. Usage is the idea of what standard American English is. Usage is the socially preferred rules that are bound in grammar and style books. But grammar itself is just the way language is structured. And so every dialect has a grammar. African American English has a grammar. That's been very written about over the last 40 years or so. Southern English has a grammar. There are rules that all of these dialects follow in the same way standard American English does. So what we're talking about when we're talking about the grammar that is taught in English language arts classroom, we're actually talking about usage. We're not talking about grammar. And I think that's an important distinction. It's one that we discuss at the beginning of the book because we want folks to understand that there's a difference.
Absolutely. I think that that's definitely a mistake that I personally have made in the English classroom over and over again. And it's something to take into consideration. And I think even outside of the English classroom, there are, numerous occasions where other subject teachers could come to their building's English teacher and say, look at this writing. And I don't know about those hypothetical English teachers, but I know when my teachers come to me and say, look at this writing, I feel guilty. I feel responsible. And in a way, a lot of things that come back in my head are, oh, I haven't been teaching them enough grammar. And I use that incorrect terminology mentally when it's actually been usage the whole time, which is something that I definitely learned when I read your book.
Well, you're describing a cycle there that just happens over and over. Like teachers feel inadequate in their own grammar knowledge. They get some writing from students. They see all the deficiencies in the writing. then they feel guilty or feel like professionally compelled to, I have to address this. How do I address it? I know, isolated grammar exercises and worksheets. At least then I can feel better that I gave it a try, right? I tried to help them and they didn't learn, because no one really ever learns that way from that kind of grammar instruction. And then the cycle happens again. And so one of the questions you asked us as we were preparing for this is, all right, so if that approach doesn't seem to work, that traditional isolated grammar instruction doesn't seem to work, but it's very attractive to people because it looks like what people think English teaching looks like, right? We're studying word parts and we're going to drill and they're going to learn this time. But if that was the case, then they would have learned, the dozens of other times that was perpetrated on students. So there's got to be a different way that we would come at this that doesn't emphasize what students can't do. And I always see this, and I'm guilty of it myself, which is, you get some writing from students and we deplore like what they couldn't do, like all the mistakes, the grammar errors, the sentence level errors in that writing. What did we really expect to get? Did we expect to get perfect writing? When has that ever happened? Right? It's like, well, maybe we should dial back our expectations to something that's positive. Like, at least we got some writing from students, right? And at least it's doing these things. There's capital letters and where they're supposed to be sometimes, and there's punctuation at the end, and they're expressing a thought. And I can follow that thought through to the end. Let's focus on what they're doing and stop assuming that they should know all these particular grammar moves, because they really haven't been taught in a way that's helped them remember.
Right, and that's our job, presumably.
Right. So let's try to clear the table here. And this is another thing that we're spending some time on with this new book. I think that this has been really left off in the discussions or conversations, is the affective piece, right? The emotional piece of, in this case, studying language or studying grammar. Maybe we just don't use that term anymore because it's like the G word, right? It evokes all these negative memories of the classroom. Very few people have positive memories of grammar instruction or learning grammar concepts in the class. So if you're going to talk about grammar in the classroom, I don't think you can just say, we're gonna study dependent clauses, and here's what they are, and here's some worksheets. I don't think we can start that way, just in operational terms. I don't think we can start that way without confronting the fact that everybody hates it, and that we come with this emotional baggage about it that taints the whole experience.
So maybe like a tangible, suggestion to take away from this for our teachers is maybe avoiding, first of all, maybe like isolated worksheets on their own. That's something we can definitely agree has been not as effective as we would have liked it to be over the many, many years that we seem to be doing that. And also the word grammar itself, like if we were to call it, communication, or, so I like the word power a lot. I try to use it in my classroom a lot. I feel like there's a word, something in there where we could have a unit, or not a unit per se, but like an ongoing revision process of power, right? That would be really great.
Like, how do we solve this communication problem or situation? How do we use words and sentences to make something happen or to meet the needs of particular people in this situation? All right, that helps to clear the air. I think in the bigger picture, if you want to make grammar a part of regular part of your classroom in a systematized way, I think that's a good idea, right? We're language arts teachers. We can't just ignore one whole facet of language arts. If we're going to do that, then we might think about, okay, well, how do I prep the ground first to make sure that this is a positive experience for students? And that might be, let's talk about all the bad experiences we've had in the past, because if we don't clear the air a little bit there, it's unlikely to work this time, because motivation is a crazy thing with people. If I don't like something and I'm forced to do it, I'm just not going to learn it. It doesn't matter how many worksheets you give me. It's not going to stick.
But I think one thing that we have to honor and speak about when we're discussing this type of language instruction is that there's a lot of worksheets are good because they have a key, right? I know where the answer is. I can flip to the back of the book and there's my answer, and I can tell my students this is the answer. When you start dealing with language in real context, there is no key. And that can be scary if you question your own grammar standing, right? If you feel like your foundation isn't strong and you're asking me to use real language pulled from different contexts and the language that students create, you want me to use that as the model by which I talk about language, all of a sudden that becomes really scary, right? And so one thing that I talk to my students a lot about in a grammar class is that it's okay not to know the answer. And you hear that all the time, but while this happens far less than it used to, I used to not know the answer a lot, and even in my grammar class that I taught last semester, there was one sentence that one of them brought to class and I was like, oh no, I gotta go spend some time with that one. I'll come back next class and let you know what I think, And I did. I brought the sentence back. I looked at it. I went and talked to Darren about it. I went and talked to our linguist in the department about it because it was so specific to that person and that situation in which that person was creating the sentence. And so I think we have to be aware that that is something that might happen when we teach language in this way. And it takes a lot of confidence as a teacher to say, I'm not so sure about that. Let me get back to you. But again, that happens less and less the more you do it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other commitments that you have to make with the invigoration of grammar that we're talking about using grammar and usage, to get things done, as it were, is that alongside being comfortable with the not knowing, which is, I feel like, maybe become a little easier with the internet at our fingertips.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's just Googling is great. But I think it's also time like that. There's more time investment in that moment where you took the sentence and you went to separate people, or you spent time online, or you had a book, versus, maybe marking it with, that traditional red pen and sending it back, and where no real learning takes place. So I guess as I say that out loud, maybe the time has to be worth the investment, because if there's no learning in the first area, we sure need it in the
wasting your time there too, right?
There's also a set of assumptions we sometimes have to ask ourselves when we're taking up like some traditional kinds of grammar instruction moves as teachers. And these are questions we ask our candidates, because they come with all these assumptions about what teaching looks like and what good teaching is. And this is something that teachers struggle with in terms of the public as well, because we have this stereotype of what English teachers do in the classroom, what they care about, and what's important to them. And that's really easy to sort of just move into that role and take on that kind of persona because it's comfortable and it's expected. And so we try to call that into question. One of these assumptions is, and this is why I think teachers get so much criticism from people who don't remember what a classroom was like, right? Is that what's so hard about teaching? What are all these teachers complaining about? You just teach the kids something. There's something they're supposed to learn. You just tell them and they'll remember it and they show you that they learned it. What's the problem? It's like, that's not how people learn. It's how sometimes it looks like learning happens. I have some information, I'm going to give it to you, and you have to remember it. But that's not actually learning, right? That's not how people negotiate meaning. And so if we fall into that trap of teaching grammar same way, here's a dependent clause, here's the definition, here's what it does in a sentence. Now practice it. Now you know dependent clauses and you can use them in your writing. It doesn't work, right? We know this if you tried this, it just doesn't work. There's no taking up of the dependent clause in a regular way on the student's writing. So we have to come at it from a different angle, right? And so this is generally our approach is, what does a dependent clause allow you to do? Well, in order to consider that, we need to think about situations where it matters to us, right? If we care about what we're invested in or we're studying or we're talking about or engaged in, we're much more likely to learn in the long run than if we don't care about it.
Absolutely. In your own classrooms, what kind of text do you have your students bring that matters to them? Like getting into that, like things that maybe our teachers who are listening today could take to their own. Like what kind of documents do you have them bring in? Do you provide them documents? How do you set up those,
You're trying to convince your parents to go to the football game on Friday night, and they don't want you to go. So how are you going to use a dependent clause to make your parents feel like their argument is heard by you through that dependent clause, and then make that turn in that independent clause to make your own argument, right? And so all of a sudden students are like, what? A dependent clause can help me get done what I want to get done in the world. And so we always need to start where students care. And I hate to break hearts, but most students don't care about writing an effective thesis statement. They care about getting what they want when they want it.
You're taking this idea that's like that's what they care about, and you're kind of introducing it that way. You've introduced the vocab, you've introduced like the technical, like this is the actual definition, but this is how we use it, and we're talking about it in a framework that actually matters to you. And in my head, I'm seeing a lot of like, I feel like you could even ask students about like individual things, like what's the worst thing that happened to you this week? And then, because those are the things they have feelings about, right? Like, we forget the best moments, let's be honest. It's the worst ones that stick with us. And then using that to talk about like the lab reports or the thesis statement. Or I'm over here thinking about, in your book, you had an example of, I believe it was a very highly political statement out of a nonfiction text. It was like, I want to say it was like some sort of news website, and the way that they had phrased it. And in my head, I'm like, that's social studies right there, right? The way that you phrase those things that maybe become primary documents really matter. I mean, I can't imagine like the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure there was a lot of thought that went into that. Like this is just permeates all of their livelihood.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I think the key is, and I think Darren and I have both said this, is you got to start where they care. Because
you don't care about something, you won't learn.
Exactly. So, we hope that the scenarios in the book get that done, but there are also ways like your idea of asking students, like, what happened this week that wasn't so awesome, So getting them to start creating the scenarios and the situations where they're like, oh, wait a second, I can better tell this experience by using a participle.
I like that idea too. It's like, bring me a situation that you or your friends have had to deal with, or that they struggle with. Bring me a conflict. Let's talk about this conflict, and let's figure out how to solve it with language moves.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What might have worked instead of what happened. And that requires, so a couple of caveats here, right? It requires a lot of flexibility and willingness to take some risks as a teacher, to look at things a little bit more tangentially, or to not come at it directly, right? Here's a dependent clause, and here's a definition, here's a worksheet. But how do I get at this from an angle that allows students to see its relevance? And it's also, this is not a magic kind of solution, right? It's not going to work the first time probably, because students are accustomed to grammar and language study being boring, right? And so you're going to have to struggle against a little bit of resistance with these kinds of activities if you're a teacher, until it becomes part of the culture of your classroom, right? That this is what we talk about when we talk about language use, that it's always relevant. At least we start with relevance, and then we move into application in other kinds of areas. And so it becomes more of a positive or constructive kind of experience, rather than a series of menial and tedious kinds of tasks that everybody hates.
And I think that's important what Darren said, and I just kind of want to highlight that again, that language is a process, right? And we've got to be willing to walk through that process with them, and be okay, and be wrong in the process, and be confused in the process, but realize that it is a process.
I'm wondering why for so long do you think that we have kind of veered away from acknowledging language as a process? I think in the questions I gave you beforehand, I had rephrased the similar question of like, why has grammar been such a hot topic? Why has it been so controversial for so long? Because I feel like it's taking us a very long time to figure it out, to figure out how to best convey it to students. And I feel like our entire conversation kind of just leads me to wonder, why is that? And I'm trying to think of an opposing subject in my head, like a juxtaposition of like, well, we know how to teach this for sure. And I'm seeing the flaws in that, because maybe, teaching is overall. But do you have any personal opinions about why this has been such a hard, difficult things for teachers to master, for students to master, and for that link in between to be connected at all?
So, Darren has said this before, that if an administrator walks into your room and everyone is doing a grammar worksheet, school is happening. That administrator is not going to say you're not doing school, right? It looks like doing school. But if you have students up, and we had a teacher who used our book, and there was a picture of like a student in a shark's head, and stuff was happening in the classroom. He's like, my students have never had so much fun learning passive voice before. That doesn't look like school. And so we have to critically ask ourselves, what does this look like? And it's not going to look like doing school. And students are comfortable with doing school, and administrators are comfortable with doing school, and parents are comfortable with doing school. But doing school doesn't always work. And so we need to break away from that. This is what school looks like to what this is what learning looks like, and what grammar, the connection between grammar and power, because we've got to start talking about that in our classrooms if we're really going to get into what language is and what language does. I had my pre-service teachers in a classroom ask me one time, well, Dr. Devereaux, you lose your accent. You drop your accent when you go present nationally, right? And I was like, okay, let's go down this path for a little while and have this discussion, because bound up in that statement were all of these assumptions about language, and we're all coming to the classroom with it, and we've got to pull those apart and deconstruct them and face some truths that might not be easy to face. But if we're really going to move forward with effective language use, language discovery, that's part of the journey.
Do you feel like there's any relationship, kind of based on your story about your student who asked if you drop your accent at presentations, do you feel like there's any connection between language and code switching in regards to grammar?
There's a lot out there in the literature about code switching in the classroom. And I think we have to be careful. So just for anyone who might not know, listening to the podcast, code switching is changing our language according to situation, purpose, or audience. So I think a lot of teachers might learn what code switching is and go, oh, thank goodness, now I have an answer. Okay, you can use your language outside of the classroom in your home, but in here, you're going to code switch, and it's going to be an English only, standard English only environment. And I think that is using code switching as a weapon, right? And that's highly problematic, because all of a sudden you're using that as an argument, as a rationale to continue to mandate students' identities dropped at the door. And that is a dangerous thing to do. And I say this in a lot of my presentations, because when you ask students to leave their language at the door, and that you can only use academic English within the bounds of classroom wall, you're ultimately asking students to choose between school and mama, and mama's going to win every time. And so we've got to really consider code switching, and what it is allowing students to move fluidly between many registers of language, right? And that's another term that's very bound in linguistics. But registers mean I don't just talk, quote unquote, again, standard academic English, and quote unquote, again, Southern English, but I speak in many different ways to many different people all throughout the day. So I have different registers that I have access to. And so it's a matter of inviting all variations into the classroom and talking about the nuances of language use, and how we can even, sometimes code mesh, which is a new term in academia, where we encourage students to use different dialects together in a given paper, because that shows real linguistic competence. If I can decide when to use which dialect to decide which message I'm portraying or sharing, like, that's power. That is power in language. And so I think code switching is a wonderful thing to talk about in the classroom. And I think code meshing is a wonderful thing to talk about in the classroom, but we have to make sure we don't use it as a weapon against our students to, again, keep their variation outside the classroom and still relegated to this otherness.
This is a long-range project. This is a year-long project, years-long project with students. And this is the struggle. Teachers want to see standard American English improvement quickly in students' writing. And it's unlikely to happen quickly, right? It's just going to be a gradual process. So, one of the things that it's like, I just want students to write in standard American English so they can write a 5-paragraph essay for that exam at the end of the year. That's all I want. I get it. I get that desire. But, one of the things we identify in strong writing is voice. It separates good writing from bad writing. But no one wants to read a voiceless 5-paragraph essay. Yeah, it might be good to know when I have to produce one of those, when the context might call for that. But we want students who are able to make sophisticated rhetorical choices that say, you know, what's needed here is voice. That's what gets me into the college I want to get in.
Mhm. And I also want to clarify, Darren and I are not arguing against standard American English instruction in the English classroom. I mean, we have to give that to our students because it gives them access to mainstream power structures in America if that's the path that they choose for themselves. But it's how we go about that instruction is what we're arguing for, maybe a nuance to look at, right? Like business as usual hadn't been working. How can we change that?
What are some lesson plans or units that you've seen your students at the collegiate level or that you yourself have practiced in the classroom? Just some real specific ways of how to have those conversations of power that you were talking about, Michelle, and to, encourage that sophisticated rhetoric like you were talking about, Darren, where you're addressing that language is this huge spectrum that we've got to be aware of.
Well, I think there are several ways. Number one, it just becomes, as you mentioned earlier, a discussion point in your classes, right? It's not like grammar is relegated or discussions of power is relegated to a certain unit or a certain book, or it is everywhere. So learning how to have those conversations on a daily basis with your students when you see it emerge in the literature that you're reading or the, whatever text you're studying at the time, like learn how to integrate those discussions into the larger picture of what your classroom looks like, so that students are always thinking about it when they're consuming the text in your classroom. So just to give you a quick example, I had a student, a teacher, high school English teacher who taught The Hobbit. And so she chose the theme language and identity, right? And so she thought, well, how is language and identity working grammatically in The Hobbit? She chose pronouns because in The Hobbit, it matters because the dwarves are saying us versus them or him, because the Hobbit has that outsider status. And so how do pronouns show insider status or outsider status, and then adjectives, which seems very simple, but he had to be a useful burglar. He couldn't just be a burglar. He had to be a useful burglar. So what happens to your identity when you're labeled in certain ways, and how do adjectives denote that identity? But how do we take these traditional 8 parts of speech and complicate them in ways so that they see language as depicting a reality?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic example of the pronouns. I'm over here, as you said, as you pointed out, the useful burglar. I definitely in my head was like, wow, that sounds a lot like the political rhetoric that was used in the last election. Like we have these adjectives and then these names. And however you may feel about that definitely affected the outcome. That had a lot of impact in a way that maybe reaches outside the English classroom.
Exactly. And so much of this, can be tied to the outside world, and what's happening and being, shared on social media. Any day you could pull something from social media and use that as an example of how we label and how labels affect our understanding of something.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you had mentioned, we'll go ahead and throw in a quick promo here. Throughout this entire podcast, we've been referencing Grammar to Get Things Done, which I introduced in the introduction, but we've also referenced a little bit about Darren and Michelle's new book. And so I was wondering if you guys would speak on that for just a few minutes. And then Michelle, also your new book that's coming out.
Sure. So we anticipate a new book coming out next late spring next year, so about a year from now. We wanted to get a little more granular, a little more close to how does this look when you're having these conversations with students over the course of a small unit, say 5 to 10 lessons or 5 to 10 days. But what kinds of conversations do you have with students? How does it sound? Not that we're providing a script. You don't have to follow a script, but to give you an idea of the kinds of classroom level interactions that you might have with students that do a number of things that come at a grammar concept in a fresh way, that's inviting and welcoming and clears away some of the negative residue of previous grammar episodes in students' lives, that's anchored on their own experiences and perspectives, and still gets at some of the academic expectations that you might want to touch upon as an English teacher.
That'll be very helpful. We'll look for that in the 2019 area. And then Michelle, you've got Teaching Language Variation in the Classroom coming out soon.
That'll be coming out at the beginning of 2019, and I have co-edited that with actually our linguist here in the English department at Kennesaw State University. So he and I asked teachers to write chapters about how they're teaching language variation and language ideology in the classroom. So you've been hearing us talk a lot in this podcast about how we kind of have to confront these ideologies that we have and that students have too about language. And so we have 8 chapters by teachers who talk about how they actually teach these things in the classroom. They each have a lesson plan at the end of their chapter. And then we also have a section where linguists are talking about how they teach their pre-service teachers to teach language ideologies and variations in the classroom. And then our final section has collaborations between teachers and linguists doing work together in the classroom on these topics.
You guys are busy. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle and Darren. I appreciate having you on here today. The discussions of power and grammar and language and how we can better suit and serve our students with a unit that has traditionally been very hated. This has been really, really helpful overall, and I'm sure that we have a lot of listeners that'll appreciate this conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And please let your listeners know that we are always available if they want to shoot us an email, tell us what they're doing in the classroom, and if they've used the book and what they've done. We're always excited to hear.
Wow, what an amazing and meaningful conversation that was with Dr. Devereaux and Dr. Krovitz. I am so glad that they were able to come on the show and really give us the opportunity to pick their brains about the issue of grammar. If you enjoyed this episode of The Suggestion Box or any of our other episodes, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes. Make sure to keep listening wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're interested, please check out our social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, all under The Suggestion Box Podcast. Just search that and we'll pop right up. If you're interested in contacting Michelle or Darren, check out the show notes for today's show. They will have their email listed in there since they are eager to hear from you and about any of your grammar experiences. Also, consider contacting the Suggestion Box Podcast because we are eager to hear from you in regards to your cool ideas that you want to suggest to our listeners. Do you have a really effective or exciting lesson plan, unit, strategy, instructional thingamabob? Tell us, let us know. Head to our website, thesuggestionboxpodcast.com, and contact us, or just shoot us an email at thesuggestionboxpodcast@gmail.com. The whole trend here, folks, the Suggestion Box Podcast. We are everywhere. Also, big thank you today to the directors of the Flint Hills Writing Project, our partner organization, Roger and Heather Caswell, to our wonderful graphic designer, Kristen McGriff, and also to Sonic Tonic Audio, who created some of the tunes that we use today. When I'm in a teaching slump, I always return to this iconic piece of teaching advice.
You just teach the kids something. There's something they're supposed to learn. You just tell them and they'll remember it and they show you that they learned it.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day and tune in next time.